The first snow in St. Mary Mead did not fall so much as settle, like sifted flour shaken from a housekeeper's hand. It dusted the yews about the green, softened the sharpness of roofs, and gave the lich gate at St. Mildred's the air of a frosted wedding cake. Inside the parish rooms, the air was warm and bright and smelled agreeably of oranges stuck with cloves, beeswax, and pies, cooling under muslin domes. Mrs. Beatrice Pottle, who had a way of moving swiftly without seeming to move at all, had arranged her domain with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Raffles displayed with mathematical precision, bric-a-brac arranged to catch both eye and purse strings, a table of knitted animals with rather serious expressions, and, under a paper holly garland, Father Christmas's grotto, a curtained corner with a crimson armchair and a sack brimming with carefully wrapped parcels. "It will do," she murmured, adjusting the angle of the cardboard star above the grotto with a competence that both calmed and cowed simultaneously. "Leonard, stop hovering over the trestle legs. They have stood for harvest suppers. They will stand for a few gingerbread men." The Reverend Pottle, who loved his wife and feared loose table legs with equal vigor, smiled and folded his hands in the manner of one who has learned when retreat is the better part of matrimonial valor. Children were already clattering in, boots tapping against the polished floor, gloves tucked hastily into sleeves. Two girls in tinsel halos argued with the passionate intensity of theologians about whether angels could be cross. A solemn boy pressed his nose to the glass of a prize hamper, assessing a jar of mincemeat as if it contained state secrets of the highest order. Miss Jane Marple arrived with the air of one who happens to be walking by and was delighted to discover such a charming arrangement of tables laden with cakes and interesting intentions. She was wrapped in a sensible grey coat and a scarf that had been darned with such exquisite neatness that the darning itself made a pattern more decorative than the original weave. Her eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, took in the room with the thoroughness of a naturalist cataloguing specimens, resting for a moment on the grotto curtain. It was a good curtain, thick. Someone had had the wit to hang an extra layer of flannel behind it to keep the draught off. Mrs. Pottle's hand again, no doubt. "Jane, you are a dear to brave the cold," Mrs. Pottle exclaimed, kissing the air near Miss Marple's cheek with the practiced efficiency of one who must greet half the parish before noon. "We are all at 6s and 7s. The post-box for Father Christmas is positively overflowing. Such dear letters. One promised not to pull the cat's tail for a whole fortnight, which shows remarkable restraint for a 7-year-old. Do have a mince pie. Not the front row. Those are for display and have been varnished to within an inch of their lives." Miss Marple, who possessed a near ethnographic interest in village displays and their underlying social structures, chose a slightly uneven pie with the assurance of one who understands that unevenness is often a mark of honest labor rather than careless preparation. "How very charming," she said, and meant it with the sincerity that had endeared her to 3 generations of villagers. "I should like to post a small contribution for the Bell Tower Fund." "Bless you," said the Reverend, his face brightening with the particular joy of a man who sees an unexpected answer to prayer. "One never thinks of bells until they are silent, and then one realizes how much they have been the heartbeat of daily life." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, thinking of a great many things people never considered until they stopped. Spouses, hot water, good temper, and the small courtesies that made civilized life possible. She slipped an envelope into the wooden collection box where coins chinked and rustled with the comfortable sound of community generosity. By 11 o'clock, the brass players from the neighboring village of Much Benham had taken their positions and produced "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," as if coaxing a particularly reluctant donkey along a muddy lane. Mrs. Ada Drake from the bakery booth, who possessed the firm opinions typically granted to those who excel at one thing and believe it extends to all others, declared loudly that brass instruments always sounded melancholy, regardless of the tune. "It puts one in mind of funerals," she observed, with the cheerful morbidity that marked her as a true connoisseur of village drama, and then appeared genuinely affronted when no one rushed to agree with her assessment. "Father Christmas!" cried the children in unison, for the curtain had twitched with theatrical timing, and from behind it emerged Major Horace Brent, retired, disguised in crimson robes and a cotton-wool beard that had seen better Christmases but retained its essential dignity. The Major possessed the good nature to allow small boys to tug experimentally at his beard while feigning appropriate distress, and the necessary gravitas to make the smallest girls believe that he was indeed the genuine article, recently arrived from the North Pole with their specific requests carefully catalogued in his memory. The gift distribution proceeded with military efficiency, modest packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, each containing something useful rather than frivolous, for this was a parish that understood the difference between want and need. There was also a sack designated specifically for letters, bulging with fat envelopes bearing hopeful handwritings, careful block letters, and one or two folded sheets tucked in as if their writers were ashamed of wanting anything at all. "Good morning, Father Christmas," said a clear voice that possessed the particular quality of making several heads turn, partly because of its cultivated tones, and partly because of the expensive fur collar that accompanied it. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael, recently settled at the old manor with her quiet companion, entered in a drift of French perfume and soft laughter that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was pale in the manner of those who show fatigue without suffering any diminishment of charm, possessing an ease in her gestures that somehow failed to extend to her gaze, which darted about the room as if cataloguing exits. At her elbow stood Miss Evelyn Grey, a woman whose neatness suggested either considerable pride or economic necessity, possibly both. Her clothes were well made but not recent, and she carried herself with the particular dignity of those who have learned to make a little go a very long way. "Mrs. Carmichael," said the Reverend, who had learned in the course of his pastoral duties to greet millionaires and milkmen with precisely the same warmth. "How very good of you to support our little gathering." "On the contrary," she replied, her smile as perfectly arranged as her hair, "I absolutely adore village traditions, so wonderfully restorative after the artificiality of London society." Her gaze passed briefly over the grotto curtain and moved on, as if deliberately avoiding any extended contemplation of the scene. Near the entrance, Lydia Brown from the post office stood sorting a stack of Christmas seals with the methodical precision that marked her as a woman who found comfort in order. She was a tidy creature, with an earnest face and the unconscious habit of smoothing the corners of everything she touched, as if the world required constant tidying. When she thought no one was observing, her glance drifted toward the letter sack with an expression that was decidedly not festive. "Ladies and gentlemen," called Mrs. Pottle, raising her voice with the expansive authority of a field marshal about to direct a crucial engagement. "To add to our entertainment, we shall share a few of the dear children's letters to Father Christmas. Only those whose young authors have graciously given their permission, naturally." She brandished a sheaf of papers and a microphone that squeaked in protest, as if objecting to such public exposure of private hopes. The first letter, read in Mrs. Pole's clear, carrying voice, begged earnestly for a paint box and a baby brother, specifying that order of preference with the brutal honesty of childhood. Gentle laughter rippled through the assembled villagers. The second letter requested no more arithmetic lessons, a sentiment that met with general agreement that mathematics was indeed overrated in the grand scheme of human happiness. The third envelope, however, was distinctly different from its predecessors. It was crafted from heavy paper with a watermark that caught the light when Mrs. Pottle tilted it, pale blue and slightly old-fashioned, the sort a lady might use when corresponding with her bank manager about serious financial matters. Mrs. Pottle, who would never deliberately pry into private correspondence, slid her finger under the flap because the letters had somehow become mixed, and one naturally assumed that all contents of the Father Christmas post were suitable for public consumption. For S, as before, she read aloud, and immediately paused because that salutation carried none of the innocent charm expected from a child's Christmas wish. She frowned at the elegant handwriting, and before her sense of propriety could redirect her course, her commitment to the program carried her voice into the opening lines. The holly arrangement was foolish. There is still blood on the scarf. Friday after evensong, if you are not there as promised. A small child near the front began to whimper, not because he understood the words, but because children possess the instinctive ability to sense when adults encounter something that disturbs the natural order. There was a collective intake of breath, a subtle rustle of unease that passed through the gathering like wind through wheat. Mrs. Pottle recovered with admirable swiftness. "Oh, my dears, that particular letter was intended for the sorting department at the North Pole. How silly of me to include it with the children's correspondence." She folded the paper with deliberate precision and set it aside, pointedly not looking at it again, as if things one refuses to acknowledge might cease to exist through sheer force of will. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael's attention became suddenly and intensely focused on the prize hamper, as if she were contemplating the philosophical implications of mincemeat preservation. Lydia Brown fumbled with a book of stamps until the cover tore with a small, distressing sound. Miss Evelyn Gray's hands, which had been smoothing her gloves, stilled entirely. Major Brent, still in character, boomed, "Next letter," with a fraction too much volume, as if attempting to drown out the echo of what had just been heard. Miss Marple's observant eyes, which had witnessed much human folly and forgotten little of consequence, rested on the abandoned letter long enough to note the green wax seal. Someone had used old-fashioned sealing wax, pressed with what appeared to be a signet ring bearing the impression of holly leaves, or perhaps berries. The wax had bled slightly around the edges, suggesting it had been applied by an unsteady hand. "Poor Mrs. Pottle," murmured Miss Marple to no one in particular, her voice carrying the gentle sympathy of one who understands that good intentions often lead to uncomfortable revelations. One should never give a lady a microphone unless one is fully prepared to hear whatever truths she might inadvertently share. "A positive scandal," breathed Mrs. Ada Drake, as delighted as if she had discovered a particularly creative new pastry recipe. "Mark my words, that S will prove to be someone we all know quite well." "Probably Sidney from the grocery," offered Mr. Ephraim Tull, who possessed the low-level cynicism of a man obliged to ring church bells for people who attended services less frequently than their professed piety would suggest. "Or perhaps the sexton," he added with scrupulous fairness, as if including his own name to demonstrate impartiality. Gradually, because human nature possesses a remarkable ability to continue functioning even when interesting disruptions occur, the fare returned to its intended purpose. Lukewarm tea became progressively cooler, coins changed hands with increasing frequency, and the Methodist ladies edged toward the raffle table wearing expressions of carefully neutral disapproval. Father Christmas resumed receiving his cue of small penitents, and from behind the curtain came the Major's habitual chuckle, a sound that had never entirely lost its parade ground authority despite years of civilian life. Mabel Finch, the village seamstress, had been pressed into service as Father Christmas's assistant because she possessed both the appropriate diminutive stature and a green cardigan that could pass for elfin attire. She perched on a wooden stool beside the great chair, maintaining a ledger of distributed gifts with the seriousness of an insurance actuary calculating risk. Miss Marple wandered among the various stalls with the appearance of casual interest, but without actual appetite. The mince pie had been quite sufficient for her modest requirements. She paused at the bookstall where Lionel Vane, a novelist currently lodging at the Blue Boar Inn on the stated pretext of requiring a change of air for his creative work, was engaged in conversation with a local farmer who explained his preference for stories featuring a good bit of shooting. Mr. Vane possessed the handsome, slightly glossy appearance of someone who expected his casual observations to be considered quotable. "You appear to have dropped something," Miss Marple said mildly, though she was not addressing the novelist directly. She had noticed a square of cream-colored paper that had somehow slipped beneath the edge of the grotto curtain. Mr. Vane followed her gaze, stooped to retrieve the wayward correspondence, and then, with the instinctive courtesy of his upbringing, offered it to Mrs. Pottle rather than examining it himself. "Oh, thank you so much," Mrs. Pottle said, accepting the letter with gratitude tinged by visible anxiety. "We must keep all the children's correspondence properly organized." However, Miss Marple observed that this particular letter was not added to the general collection. Instead, Mrs. Pottle tucked it quickly into her apron pocket, and her hand remained there as if large aprons had been specifically designed for the purpose of helping their wearers maintain composure during social crises. The incident occurred when the brass band was launching into their second ambitious assault on God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen, and the tinsel-crowned angels had finally reached a theological compromise regarding their emotional capacities. There was a small, sharp sound from within the grotto, like a teacup being set down with more force than intended. A pause followed, peculiar and elongated, as if the entire room were collectively holding its breath in anticipation of something undefined, but significant. Then Mabel Finch came stumbling through the curtain, her carefully maintained elfin dignity destroyed, her green cardigan snagging on a protruding pin and tearing with a neat, distressing sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. "Mrs. Pottle," she managed, and then simply, "Oh," and then nothing further, because the English language had temporarily abandoned her in her moment of greatest need. Mrs. Pottle moved with the swift efficiency that marked her as a woman accustomed to managing crises, reaching the curtain without appearing to push past anyone. The Reverend followed close behind, as did Dr. Hartwell, who had been consuming weak tea while wearing the expression of a man attempting to solve a particularly vexing crossword puzzle. A small crowd formed around the grotto entrance, with the elastic quality typical of such gatherings, loose at first, then drawing tight with collective curiosity and concern. "Please step back," said Dr. Hartwell, and his calm, professional tone made people comply without conscious thought. After a moment's hesitation, he drew the curtain wider, revealing the scene within. Father Christmas remained seated in his throne-like chair, but with the particular stillness that suggested he had grown very tired indeed. His gloved hand had fallen to one side, and there was a teacup on the small table beside him, tilted at an angle that had allowed its contents to spread across the white cloth in a brown stain shaped rather like a flower petal. The cotton-wool beard had slipped slightly, exposing the familiar, obstinate chin of Major Horace Brent. His eyes were open, but they gazed with the unseeing fixity that indicated their owner had departed for destinations unknown. "Doctor," asked Mrs. Pottle, her voice maintaining its conversational tone while her eyes asked everything else that words could not safely express in front of the children. Dr. Hartwell, who had witnessed far worse scenes during a particularly difficult summer in a military hospital and had learned not to speak of such experiences, bent forward and gently closed those vacant eyes with one practiced finger. "I am very much afraid," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of professional certainty and personal regret. "A heart attack, perhaps," suggested the Reverend, grasping for an explanation that would make sense of the senseless and provide appropriate words for the widow's comfort he would soon need to offer. "Quite possibly," agreed Dr. Hartwell carefully. "We shall know more when the proper authorities have conducted their examination." He was a kind man who understood that speculation in such circumstances served no useful purpose and often caused considerable harm. The air within the grotto carried the mingled scents of cinnamon, orange pomanders, and the simple, human smell of wool that had been warmed by firelight. Miss Marple positioned herself slightly to one side, having learned through long experience to remain where observation was possible but attention was not attracted. She looked down briefly, then up again, then deliberately away, because people were watching, and it was unwise to appear too interested in details that others might prefer to overlook. Mrs. Pottle, after a moment of visible internal struggle, straightened her shoulders with the resolution of one who has faced parish crises before and survived them. "Leonard, please telephone Constable Pierce immediately. No one should leave just yet. I'm sure the authorities will want to speak with everyone who was present. Mrs. Drake, if you would be so kind, perhaps you could organize some quiet activities for the children at the far end of the hall." "Of course," said Mrs. Drake, demonstrating an unexpected gentleness as she shepherded the smaller members of the congregation toward a corner where jam tarts and a hastily improvised puppet show provided excellent distraction from adult mysteries. At the bookstall, Lionel Vane murmured, "Good God," in a tone that suggested equal measures of horror and professional curiosity about the dramatic possibilities of the situation. Lydia Brown compressed her lips into a straight, disapproving line, as if the Major's untimely demise represented a serious breach of postal regulations. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael rested one elegantly gloved hand on the back of a chair, as if reassuring herself of its substantial reality, while her companion stood with such perfect stillness that the winter light on her carefully arranged hair remained absolutely motionless. Miss Marple's attention drifted with apparent casualness to the teacup at Father Christmas's elbow. There was a trace on the rim, a smudge that might have been nothing more significant than the residue of hasty consumption. But beside it, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look, was a faint, crescent-shaped mark that seemed inconsistent with Major Brent's habitual fastidiousness about his appearance. However, such observations were for later consideration, and she was, above all, a gentlewoman who did not stare at evidence while decent people were being properly mourned. "How absolutely dreadful," she said softly to Mrs. Pottle, who was already wrestling with the practical concern of how one informs a deceased person's sister, particularly when said sister resided in Weston-super-Mare and harbored a well-known aversion to railway travel. "How very dreadful indeed," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. And then, with that same gentle voice that had earlier noted Mrs. Pottle's inadvertent reading of Friday After Evensong, she added quietly, "I do hope, Father, Christmas received only the appropriate letters today. It can be so terribly awkward when people accidentally post the wrong correspondence to the wrong recipients." The words hung in the warm air of the parish hall, as soft and seemingly innocent as snowflakes, but carrying within them the suggestion that this peaceful Christmas morning in St. Mary Mead had become something far more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Constable Pierce arrived with the measured dignity of a man who understood that village disturbances, however unusual, required the same methodical attention he devoted to bicycle maintenance and the weekly inspection of hedgerow boundaries. His notebook emerged from his breast pocket with ceremonial gravity, and he surveyed the scene within the grotto with the careful attention of someone determined not to overlook any detail that might later prove significant, though his expression suggested he would have preferred his first encounter with suspicious death to occur somewhere less festooned with paper angels and artificial snow. "Now then," he said, his pencil poised with official readiness, "I'll need statements from everyone present, beginning with whoever discovered the deceased." His gaze settled on Mabel Finch, who had been provided with a chair and remained clutched around an untouched cup of tea, as if it were an anchor in suddenly uncertain waters. "I was sitting just beside him," Mabel managed, her voice carrying the particular tremor of someone who has witnessed something requiring considerable time to forget. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The Major was so patient with the children, made a little joke about elves being underpaid for Christmas work. Then he asked for tea, said the robes were making him rather warm. "And you prepared his tea personally?" Constable Pierce inquired, his attention focused with the intensity of someone who understood that details, however small, often proved essential. "From the urn behind the curtain. Yes. Milk and 2 sugars, the way he always takes it." She paused, correcting herself with visible distress. Took it. He drank it straight away, seemed quite grateful. Then he grew very quiet, and when I looked over, her gesture toward the chair conveyed everything that words could not safely express in present company. Miss Marple, positioned near enough to observe without appearing intrusive, noticed that Mabel's account contained a small discrepancy. In section 1, the girl had mentioned lemon, not milk and sugar. Such variations in testimony she had learned through long experience often revealed more than their speakers intended. People's memories, particularly under stress, had a way of reshaping themselves to fit what seemed most plausible rather than what had actually occurred. Dr. Hartwell straightened from his examination with the deliberate movements of someone who has reached conclusions he would have preferred to avoid. "I cannot make definitive statements without proper facilities," he said carefully. "However, the circumstances suggest the possibility of cardiac arrest. Major Brent was 73, though remarkably vigorous. Still, there are certain irregularities that warrant professional attention." "What sort of irregularities?" Mrs. Pottle asked, though her tone suggested she was not entirely certain she wished to hear the answer. "The coloring is somewhat unusual," Dr. Hartwell replied with measured precision. "And there is a faint but distinctive odor about the tea service that I cannot immediately identify. It may signify nothing, but in cases of sudden death, caution is always advisable." The unspoken word poison seemed to hover in the warm air like incense, coloring every subsequent glance toward the innocent-appearing teacup. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael's face had grown pale in a way that suggested more than ordinary shock, while Lydia Brown began sorting through her Christmas seals with movements that had become increasingly agitated. "I say," offered Lionel Vane, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his observations welcomed. "Might this connect to that rather peculiar letter Mrs. Pottle read earlier? The one mentioning blood and Friday evening appointments seemed rather ominous in retrospect." Mrs. Pottle's hand moved instinctively to her apron pocket, and Miss Marple observed the gesture with the mild interest of someone noting the behavior of birds at a feeding station. The cream-colored letter remained there, its presence as tangible as if it were glowing through the fabric. "That correspondence was clearly misfiled," Mrs. Pottle said firmly. "A simple sorting error." "Nevertheless," Constable Pierce said, his notebook reopening with official purpose, "I should examine any letters that might relate to this morning's events, including any set aside for later consideration." Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with the attention of someone reading a particularly complex novel. Each villager was attempting to fit the Major's sudden death into their existing understanding of him, or perhaps to construct a narrative that suited their own inclinations toward drama. The ominous letter had transformed a potential natural death to something far more sinister in the collective imagination. Her gaze drifted, with apparent casualness, to the holly arrangement nearest the grotto. Beneath one glossy spray, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look, was a thread caught and darkened, brown now with air, but suggesting it had once been red. She did not touch it. Experience had taught her the virtue of letting evidence remain undisturbed until its moment came. The morning's tragedy, she reflected, had certainly stirred the tranquil waters of St. Mary Mead, revealing undercurrents that few had suspected lay beneath the surface of village propriety. Constable Pierce accepted the pale blue envelope from Mrs. Pottle's reluctant fingers with the careful precision of a man who understood that evidence, once contaminated by careless handling, became considerably less useful to the cause of justice. The green wax seal bore the clear impression of holly leaves, or perhaps berries, pressed with what appeared to be a signet ring, though the wax had bled slightly around the edges as if applied by an unsteady hand, or in circumstances requiring haste. He broke the seal with deliberate care and unfolded the heavy paper, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. The elegant handwriting, executed with the sort of fountain pen that suggested both education and a certain adherence to traditional standards, contained none of the innocent charm one might expect from Christmas correspondence. "For S, as before," he read aloud, his voice carrying none of Mrs. Pottle's earlier theatrical enthusiasm. "The holly arrangement was foolish. There is still blood on the scarf. Friday after evensong. If you are not there as promised, I shall be forced to take more decisive action. Your continued evasions serve no purpose save to complicate what should be a simple matter of justice." He paused, glancing up at the assembled faces with the expression of a man who had hoped his Saturday morning would involve nothing more complex than a bicycle theft. "It's signed with what appears to be the initial H." The collective intake of breath that followed carried with it the particular quality of air before thunderstorms. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael's gloved fingers, which had been resting lightly on her handbag clasp, tightened with visible tension. Miss Evelyn Gray's carefully maintained composure seemed to require increasing effort, while Lydia Brown ceased her nervous sorting of Christmas seals entirely, her gaze fixed on the constable with an intensity that suggested either deep civic concern or personal involvement. "Friday after evensong," repeated the Reverend thoughtfully. "That would have been last evening. The service concluded at 6:30, and the church remained open until I locked it at 9 o'clock. I was arranging the nativity figures with Mrs. Pottle. The donkey had developed an unfortunate tendency to topple forward. Dr. Hartwell, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of the tea service with the methodical attention his profession demanded, straightened with the measured movements of someone who has discovered something he would have preferred not to find. "Constable, I must express concern about the contents of this teacup. There's a distinctly bitter odor that seems inconsistent with ordinary tea, and the residue around the rim suggests the addition of something beyond the usual milk and sugar." Mabel Finch, still clutching her untouched cup as if it were an anchor in suddenly uncertain waters, looked up with visible distress. "But I prepared his tea exactly as he requested. Milk and 2 sugars, just as he always takes it. I mean, took it." Her voice carried the particular tremor of someone who has witnessed something requiring considerable time to forget. "Actually," Dr. Hartwell said gently, "Major Brent was quite strict about avoiding sugar. We discussed it after his last examination in September. His constitution required careful attention to such matters. He was also particular about preferring lemon when it could be obtained, though he understood that wartime rationing made such preferences something of a luxury." Mabel's face grew pale with the dawning realization that her account contained a discrepancy she could not immediately explain. "But he specifically asked for milk and sugar today," she insisted, then paused as memory began to reassert itself with uncomfortable clarity. "Though now that you mention it, someone did say something about lemon. A voice over my shoulder, quite smooth and pleasant, suggesting that Father Christmas would prefer a slice of lemon. There was a little silver box. Someone reached past me with it." "A silver box?" Constable Pierce inquired, his pencil poised with official readiness. "Small and rather elegant. The sort ladies carry for headache powders or throat lozenges. The hand was gloved, light-colored, not wool, but something finer. Kid leather, perhaps." Mabel's eyes widened as the implications of her recollection became clear. "I thought it was kindness, someone knowing the Major's preferences better than I did." Miss Marple, who had been observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone reading a particularly complex piece of needlework, allowed her gaze to drift toward the holly arrangement nearest the grotto. The darkened thread she had noticed earlier remained caught among the glossy leaves, positioned where someone reaching for the tea service might easily brush against it. If one were to examine that thread more closely, she suspected it might prove to match the fabric of a particular garment, though such observations were best kept private until their significance became clear. "The letter mentions blood on a scarf," she observed mildly. her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who has spent decades managing parish committees and therefore understands the delicate art of directing attention without appearing to do so. One wonders whether the holly arrangement might have been disturbed by someone in rather more haste than usual. Holly can be so aggressively decorative, particularly when one is attempting to manage delicate tasks while wearing good gloves. Constable Pierce followed her gaze and noticed the thread for the first time. He produced a pair of tweezers from his pocket, their existence betraying an ambition toward thoroughness he had hitherto concealed, and carefully lifted the darkened fiber into an envelope. "My thanks, Miss Marple. One learns to appreciate the observations of those who notice details others might overlook." Lionel Vane, who had been maintaining an uncharacteristic silence, cleared his throat with the diffidence of someone uncertain whether his contribution would be welcomed. "I couldn't help but notice that several people did visit the grotto area during the morning. Research purposes, you understand. I'm working on a piece about village traditions. Mrs. Carmichael brought a donation early on, and Miss Gray helped arrange some of the gift packages. Even I stopped by to discuss local customs with the Major, though our conversation was brief." Mrs. Carmichael's face had grown pale in a way that suggested more than ordinary shock at the morning's events. "I merely wish to contribute to the Bell Tower Fund," she said, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who has learned to choose words with precision. The Major was most gracious about accepting the donation, though he did seem somewhat preoccupied. The investigation, Miss Marple reflected, was beginning to reveal the sort of undercurrents that often lay beneath the surface of village propriety. The innocent Christmas fair had become a stage upon which long-concealed secrets were demanding their moment of revelation, and she suspected that the morning's tragedy was merely the visible portion of something far more complex and carefully planned than anyone had initially imagined. "This silver box," Constable Pierce continued, his attention focused on Mabel Finch with the methodical patience of someone who understood that crucial details often emerged only through careful questioning. "Can you describe it more precisely? The size, the appearance, any distinguishing features?" Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she attempted to reconstruct the moment that had seemed so ordinary at the time. "It was small, Constable, perhaps 3 inches long and half as wide. Very elegant, polished silver, I should think, though it might have been silver plate. The sort of thing a lady might carry for lozenges or headache powders. The hand that held it was gloved in light-colored kid leather, very fine quality. The voice was cultured, pleasant. She said something about Father Christmas preferring lemon, and I thought how considerate it was of someone to know his preferences better than I did." Dr. Hartwell, who had been examining the tea service with increasing thoroughness, looked up from his inspection with the grave expression of a man who has discovered something he would have preferred not to find. "The residue in this cup contains traces of something that produces a distinctly bitter almond scent when heated. I cannot make definitive statements without proper laboratory analysis, but the symptoms and the odor suggest the possibility of cyanide poisoning." The word hung in the warm air of the parish hall like a death knell, transforming the morning's tragedy from a possible natural death into something far more sinister. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael's face grew pale in a way that suggested more than ordinary shock, while her gloved fingers tightened on her handbag clasp with visible tension. "Cyanide," repeated the Reverend, his voice carrying the particular horror of a man who has spent his life ministering to natural deaths and finds himself confronted with deliberate evil. "But surely, who would possess such a substance, and why would anyone wish harm to Major Brent?" Constable Pierce, who had been conducting a more thorough search of the grotto area, emerged from behind the curtain holding a second envelope with the careful precision of someone handling potentially dangerous evidence. "It appears Father Christmas received rather more correspondence than the children's Christmas wishes," he observed, his tone carrying grim significance. "This one bears the same green wax seal and elegant handwriting as the first letter." He broke the seal with deliberate care and unfolded the heavy paper, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. "It's quite brief," he announced. "No more blunders. S. Burn the scarf. H." He looked up at the assembled faces with the expression of a man who realizes his quiet Saturday morning has become something requiring considerably more expertise than bicycle maintenance. The urgency of this correspondence suggests that yesterday evening's meeting at the church may have been rather more significant than initially apparent. Miss Evelyn Gray, who had maintained her careful composure throughout the morning's revelations, finally spoke with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations with limited resources. "Perhaps I should clarify certain matters that may prove relevant to your investigation, Constable. I've been in Major Brent's employ for the past 6 months, managing his correspondence and household accounts. He did receive letters of a personal nature, though he was always most discreet about such matters." The admission created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as conversations ceased and attention focused on this unexpected revelation. Constable Pierce's pencil moved with renewed purpose across his notebook pages. "Personal correspondence of what nature, Miss Gray?" he inquired, maintaining official neutrality, while his eyes suggested considerable interest in the answer. "Major Brent served in intelligence during the war," she replied carefully. "Certain matters from that time had recently required his attention. There were photographs that certain parties wished to remain private. The Major was attempting to resolve the situation through private negotiation rather than public exposure." Lydia Brown, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the morning's proceedings, suddenly rose from her chair with the abrupt movement of someone who has reached a decision she would have preferred to avoid. "I must speak truthfully about yesterday evening," she announced, her voice carrying the particular tremor of someone confessing to behavior she deeply regretted. "I was at the church after evensong, and Major Brent was indeed there, but he was not alone." The collective attention of the room focused on her with uncomfortable intensity, and she seemed to shrink slightly under the scrutiny, while simultaneously squaring her shoulders with determination. "There was another person present, someone I recognized. They were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion near the bell tower. I could hear raised voices, though I could not distinguish the words clearly. When I approached to inquire whether assistance was needed, the other person departed rather hastily through the vestry door." "And this other person was?" Constable Pierce prompted, his pencil poised with official readiness. Before Lydia could respond, however, a new voice interjected from near the entrance to the hall. "Constable Pierce, I understand there's been some sort of incident involving Major Brent." All heads turned to observe the arrival of Mr. Timothy Grimshaw, a retired solicitor whose perpetually aggrieved expression and tendency toward verbose complaint had made him a familiar figure in village disputes. His presence immediately sparked a ripple of whispered speculation among the assembled villagers, for his bitter boundary dispute with Major Brent had provided entertainment for months. "Mr. Grimshaw," Mrs. Ada Drake murmured with the delighted anticipation of someone who has discovered a particularly promising new ingredient for village gossip. "How very convenient of you to arrive just now." Miss Marple, who had been observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone reading a particularly complex piece of needlework, allowed her gaze to drift thoughtfully among the assembled faces. Mr. Grimshaw's arrival had certainly provided the villagers with an obvious suspect. His disputes with Major Brent were well documented, and his cantankerous nature made him an easy target for suspicion. However, she reflected, obvious suspects in her experience rarely proved to be the actual culprits. The human tendency to embrace simple explanations often prevented proper attention to more subtle possibilities. Her pale blue eyes rested momentarily on Mrs. Carmichael's light-colored gloves, pearl-gray kid leather of excellent quality, with a small score mark near the index finger that might have been caused by a thorn or other sharp object. The gloves matched Mabel's description precisely, though such gloves were not uncommon among ladies of good breeding. Still, when combined with the elegant handwriting, the mysterious photographs, and the Friday evening meeting at the church, the coincidences were beginning to form a pattern that required careful consideration. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who has spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity. One does wonder whether the most obvious explanations are always the most accurate ones. In my experience, the truth often wears a more subtle disguise. The investigation, she realized, was only beginning to reveal the carefully hidden currents that lay beneath St. Mary Mead's tranquil surface, and she suspected that before the day was finished, several long-buried secrets would be forced into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Constable Pierce, his attention momentarily diverted by Mr. Grimshaw's theatrical entrance, returned his focus to Lydia Brown with the patient persistence of a man who understood that crucial testimony often emerged only through careful questioning. Miss Brown, you were about to identify the person you observed with Major Brent at the church on Friday evening. Lydia's hands, which had found temporary refuge in the methodical sorting of Christmas seals, stilled entirely as she gathered her courage. The weight of the room's collective attention seemed to press upon her shoulders, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular tremor of someone confessing to knowledge she would have preferred not to possess. "It was Mrs. Carmichael, Constable," she said, her words emerging with the reluctant clarity of someone who has wrestled with conscience and found duty the victor. "I recognized her distinctive fur collar and that particular French perfume she wears. They were engaged in what appeared to be a rather heated discussion near the bell tower, and when she noticed my presence, she departed quite hastily through the vestry door." The revelation created a ripple of whispered speculation that Mrs. Pottle attempted to quell with a sharp glance, though her own expression suggested considerable interest in this unexpected development. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael, whose carefully maintained composure had been steadily deteriorating throughout the morning's proceedings, rose from her chair with the abrupt movement of someone who has reached the limits of diplomatic patience. "That is an entirely erroneous identification," she stated, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having her word accepted without question. "I was at the old manor throughout Friday evening, attending to correspondence and preparation for today's fair. Miss Gray can certainly corroborate my presence there." Miss Evelyn Gray nodded with the precise loyalty of someone whose employment depends upon unwavering support, though Miss Marple observed that her confirmation carried a fractional hesitation that suggested internal conflict between truth and necessity. Mrs. Carmichael was indeed occupied with household matters, she said carefully. "We reviewed the arrangements for the Christmas fair over a late supper." Mr. Timothy Grimshaw, who had been vibrating with barely suppressed indignation at being insufficiently consulted, seized the opportunity to establish his own innocence with characteristic verbose enthusiasm. "I shall state categorically that I spent Friday evening at the Blue Boar Inn, engaged in a perfectly respectable game of cribbage with Mr. Blount and several other gentlemen. The landlord will confirm my presence until well past 10 o'clock. As for my dispute with Major Brent, it was proceeding through entirely proper legal channels and required no resort to dramatic solutions." Dr. Hartwell, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of the tea service, straightened with the measured movements of someone who has discovered additional evidence requiring careful documentation. "Constable, I should mention that there are traces of lipstick on the cup's rim, pale rose in color, applied with considerable care. This suggests either that a lady drank from this cup before it was given to Major Brent, or that someone wished to create that impression." The observation prompted a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, as several pairs of eyes drifted toward the assembled ladies with new speculation. Mrs. Carmichael's mouth, Miss Marple noted, bore the delicate traces of precisely that shade of pale rose, applied with the expertise that marked her as a woman who understood the importance of maintaining appearances, even under trying circumstances. A small commotion near the cloakroom interrupted the developing tension as one of the tinsel-crowned angels approached Mrs. Pottle with the urgent importance that marked childhood discoveries. "Please, ma'am, we found something peculiar behind the coats," the child announced, holding up a dove-gray cashmere scarf that bore a distinctive dark stain near its fringed edge. Constable Pierce accepted the garment with his tweezers, his expression growing increasingly grave as he examined the evidence. The scarf was of excellent quality, the sort worn by ladies of refined taste and adequate means, and the stain appeared consistent with the blood on the scarf mentioned in the mysterious correspondence. "We shall need to determine ownership of this item," he announced, lifting the fabric slightly to reveal threads snagged along one edge, as if it had been pulled against something sharp and unforgiving. Miss Marple, whose observational skills had been honed through decades of managing parish committees and their attendant human complications, allowed her gaze to drift thoughtfully among the assembled faces. The morning's investigation had certainly revealed undercurrents that few had suspected lay beneath the surface of village propriety, but she reflected that the most obvious explanations were often the least accurate ones. Her attention settled momentarily on Mrs. Carmichael's pearl-gray gloves, noting again the small score mark near the index finger that might have been caused by hollythorns or other sharp vegetation. When combined with the elegant handwriting, the mysterious Friday evening meeting, and the increasingly desperate tone of the threatening correspondence, the evidence was beginning to form a pattern that required careful consideration. "How very interesting," she murmured softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who has spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity. The investigation, she realized, was revealing carefully hidden secrets, but the true pattern remained obscured by the natural human preference for obvious villains over subtle truths. Constable Pierce lifted the dove-gray cashmere scarf with his tweezers, examining the dark stain near its fringed edge with the methodical attention his training demanded. The fabric was of excellent quality, the sort worn by ladies of refined taste and adequate means, and the irregular pattern of the staining suggested it had been applied under circumstances requiring considerable haste. "This appears to be blood," Dr. Hartwell confirmed, leaning closer to examine the evidence without touching it. "Fresh enough to have occurred within the past day or two, and the pattern suggests it was dabbed rather than naturally absorbed from a wound. Someone used this scarf to clean something. Or someone." Mrs. Fenella Carmichael's face had grown pale in a way that suggested more than ordinary shock at the morning's revelations. Her gloved fingers, which had been resting lightly on her handbag clasp, tightened with visible tension as she regarded the stained garment with what appeared to be recognition rather than mere curiosity. "I believe I observed Mrs. Carmichael wearing that particular scarf earlier this week," offered Lionel Vane, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who prided himself on noticing details others might overlook. "Rather distinctive shade of gray, and the fringed edges caught my attention. I make a habit of observing such particulars for my writing, you understand." The admission created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, though Mrs. Carmichael maintained her composure with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to managing difficult social situations. "I own several scarves of similar appearance," she said carefully. "One cannot definitively identify ownership based on color alone, particularly when the fabric has been altered by circumstances." Miss Evelyn Gray, who had been maintaining her careful composure throughout the morning's proceedings, seemed to struggle with some internal conflict as she observed her employer's growing distress. The loyalty that marked her professional relationship was clearly being tested by the mounting evidence, though she remained silent for the moment. Constable Pierce, continuing his methodical examination of the grotto area, discovered additional evidence that commanded immediate attention. Behind the curtain, partially concealed beneath the small table that had held Major Brent's tea service, lay a flat silver box no larger than a lady's compact. When he lifted it with his tweezers and carefully opened the hinged lid, a sharp, unmistakable odor rose from within, the bitter almond scent that Dr. Hartwell had detected in the teacup. "Do not inhale, Constable," Dr. Hartwell warned, producing his handkerchief to wrap the evidence. "That residue confirms my earlier suspicions about the cause of Major Brent's death." Someone introduced cyanide into his tea using this container. The revelation transformed the morning's tragedy from a possible natural death into something far more sinister and premeditated. Miss Marple, who had been observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone reading a particularly complex piece of needlework, allowed her gaze to drift thoughtfully among the assembled faces. The elegant silver box, she noted, bore the hallmarks of expensive craftsmanship, the sort of item a lady of refinement might carry for headache powders or throat lozenges. "How very interesting," she murmured softly, her pale blue eyes resting momentarily on Mrs. Carmichael's pearl-gray gloves. The score mark near the index finger that she had noticed earlier might indeed have been caused by holly thorns, as suggested by the darkened thread still caught in the arrangement above the grotto. When combined with the blood-stained scarf and the mysterious silver box, the evidence was beginning to form a pattern that required careful consideration. A small commotion near the prize table interrupted the developing tension as one of the Methodist ladies approached Constable Pierce with obvious reluctance. "Begging your pardon, Constable, but we found this caught in the holly garland when we were tidying up for the children." She held out a delicate silver locket, its chain broken as if it had been pulled away with considerable force. Pierce examined the jewelry with growing interest, noting the elegant monogram, the letter E executed in flowing script, and a small dent on the back that suggested recent impact against something hard and unforgiving. "Does anyone recognize this piece?" he inquired, holding it up for inspection. Miss Evelyn Gray's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where a pale mark suggested the recent absence of jewelry she was accustomed to wearing. That is mine," she admitted quietly. "The chain must have broken when I was helping arrange the gift packages earlier. I hadn't realized it was missing." The explanation carried the ring of truth, but Miss Marple observed that the break in the chain appeared violent rather than natural, as if the locket had been torn away during some sort of struggle. The discovery added another layer to the morning's mysteries, suggesting that more than one person had been involved in the events leading to Major Brent's death. "Miss Gray," Constable Pierce said gently, recognizing the distress in her voice, "you mentioned earlier that Major Brent had been dealing with matters from his wartime service. Might these have involved photographs of a sensitive nature?" The question hung in the warm air of the parish hall, and Miss Gray's carefully maintained composure seemed to require increasing effort. She glanced toward Mrs. Carmichael, who was watching her with an expression that combined desperation with silent pleading. "There were certain documents," Miss Gray said carefully, "that Major Brent had acquired during his intelligence work. Some parties had expressed interest in retrieving them through private negotiation rather than other means. The Major was attempting to resolve these matters discreetly, as befitted a gentleman." The admission revealed another dimension to the morning's tragedy, suggesting that Major Brent's death might have been connected to secrets from the past that someone was desperate to keep buried. Miss Marple reflected that the peaceful Christmas fair had become a stage upon which long-concealed secrets were demanding their moment of revelation, though she suspected that the true pattern of events remained more complex than the obvious explanations being offered. The investigation, she realized, was approaching a crucial point where carefully hidden truths would be forced into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny, and she found herself wondering whether the assembled villagers were prepared for the revelations that seemed increasingly inevitable as the evidence continued to accumulate. "These documents of a sensitive nature," Constable Pierce continued, his notebook poised with renewed purpose. "I shall need to examine any relevant correspondence and personal effects. With your permission, ladies, I should like to inspect the contents of handbags belonging to those who were near the grotto this morning. Purely as a matter of eliminating possibilities, you understand." Mrs. Pottle, recognizing the delicate nature of such a request, moved with her characteristic efficiency to manage the situation. "Perhaps the Methodist ladies might organize a quiet carol for the children," she suggested, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to directing parish activities during moments of crisis. something to occupy young minds while the constable conducts his necessary inquiries. Mrs. Fenella Carmichael opened her elegant leather handbag with the resigned grace of someone who has reached the limits of diplomatic evasion. The contents revealed themselves with uncomfortable precision. A silver compact, a tube of pale rose lipstick that matched exactly the traces Dr. Hartwell had observed on the teacup, a small atomizer of French perfume, and a neatly folded handkerchief bearing a faint brownish smear along one edge. The handkerchief, Dr. Hartwell observed with professional neutrality, appears to bear traces consistent with dried blood, though I cannot make definitive statements without proper analysis. Miss Evelyn Gray's smaller reticule yielded more modest contents: a coin purse, a stub of pencil, and an old-fashioned fountain pen with elegant gold trim. Her fingers trembled slightly as Constable Pierce returned the broken locket, and Miss Marple's observant eyes noted a small but distinct blister at the base of Miss Gray's right forefinger, the sort one acquires from handling sealing wax too near the flame. Lydia Brown's practical handbag contained the tools of her postal trade: stamp books, twine, and, significantly, a stick of green sealing wax alongside a small brass stamp bearing the impression of holly leaves. "We stock a festive set for the Christmas season," she explained, her voice carrying the earnest quality of someone eager to demonstrate complete cooperation. "Terribly popular it is. I've sold them to Mrs. Pottle for the raffle envelopes, to Mr. Vane for his correspondence, and to Miss Gray for the old Manor's Christmas cards." She paused, then added with visible reluctance, "and to Major Brent himself earlier in the week." Miss Marple, who possessed the gift of asking questions that seemed to concern only domestic trifles, turned to Mrs. Pottle with gentle curiosity. "My dear, you have been so resourceful with provisions this morning. Did we have lemon available for the tea service?" Mrs. Pottle, startled by the seemingly innocent inquiry, shook her head with certainty. "No, Jane, not for the general urn. I set aside 2 lemons for tomorrow's trifle and the clergy table. They're in the vicarage pantry under muslin cover. There were certainly no slices available by the grotto." The revelation created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, for Mabel's earlier testimony about someone offering lemon for Major Brent's tea now appeared to describe something that could not have existed through honest means. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested thoughtfully on the assembled faces, noting how this small discrepancy cast new shadows over the morning's events. "Mrs. Carmichael," Constable Pierce said, his voice carrying courteous but unmistakable authority, "Miss Brown has stated that she observed you at St. Mildred's on Friday evening in conversation with the deceased. Will you now confirm or deny that you met Major Brent after evensong?" A dozen calculations flickered behind Mrs. Carmichael's carefully composed features, pride warring with fear, and the cultivated instinct for choosing the least disastrous version of truth. "I met him," she admitted finally, her voice carrying the precision of someone who has learned to navigate dangerous conversations. "For perhaps 10 minutes in the south aisle. He possessed certain papers that concerned me, and I had intended to make a charitable contribution in exchange for their discretion. There was no quarrel, Constable. I pricked my finger on the holly arrangement by the pulpit. The verger had placed it there with rather more enthusiasm than skill. I used my scarf to stanch the bleeding." The admission explained the blood-stained cashmere, though it raised additional questions about the sequence of events. Dr. Hartwell examined the faint score mark on Mrs. Carmichael's pearl-grey glove with professional interest. "A hollythorn could certainly have caused such an injury," he observed neutrally. "These papers Major Brent possessed," Constable Pierce continued, "might they have been photographic in nature? Documents from wartime intelligence work that certain parties would prefer to remain private?" Mrs. Carmichael's face grew pale in a way that suggested recognition rather than mere surprise. "My maiden name was Helena Hartwell," she said quietly. "I served as a medical liaison with various intelligence operations during the war. Major Brent and I worked together on several occasions, which is how he came to possess certain documentation of activities that occurred during those difficult times. I sometimes signed correspondence with that initial when dealing with matters requiring discretion. The revelation added another dimension to the morning's mysteries, connecting the ominous letters to wartime secrets that someone was desperate to keep buried. Miss Gray, whose loyalty to her employer was clearly being tested by the mounting evidence, finally spoke with visible resolve. "The documents are not here, Constable," she announced, her voice carrying newfound strength. "Major Brent insisted they be kept secure, separate from daily access. They are safely deposited in a strong box at the local bank, accessible only by a specific key and coded instruction. He entrusted the key to my care last evening, just before our meeting concluded at the church." Lydia Brown, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the revelations, rose with the decisive movement of someone who has wrestled with conscience and found duty the victor. "I must speak truthfully about what I observed on Friday evening," she declared. "The conversation between Major Brent and Mrs. Carmichael was indeed heated, but there was a third person present, someone who departed through the bell tower entrance when I approached. I caught only a glimpse, but the figure moved with considerable stealth and wore a dark coat. Miss Marple, who had been observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone reading a particularly complex mystery, reflected that the morning's investigation was revealing currents far more dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. The peaceful Christmas fair had become a stage upon which long-concealed secrets were demanding their moment of revelation, and she found herself wondering whether the assembled villagers were prepared for the truths that seemed increasingly inevitable as the evidence continued to accumulate in ways that pointed toward carefully planned deception rather than crimes of passion. "How very interesting," she murmured softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who has spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity. "One does find that the most carefully laid plans often reveal themselves through the smallest inconsistencies, a missing lemon here, a broken locket there, and always the tendency of guilty parties to provide just slightly too much explanation for perfectly innocent actions." The investigation, she realized, was approaching the moment when carefully hidden truths would be forced into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny, though she suspected that the obvious explanations being offered might prove to be elaborate disguises for more subtle and dangerous realities. Constable Pierce's methodical attention focused on Lydia Brown's revelation of the mysterious third person, his pencil poised with the particular precision of someone who understands that crucial testimony often emerges through patient questioning. "Miss Brown, this third individual you observed departing through the bell tower entrance. Can you provide any additional details about their appearance or manner of movement?" Lydia's hands, which had found temporary refuge in the nervous arrangement of her Christmas seals, stilled as she concentrated on reconstructing the memory that had been troubling her since the previous evening. The figure moved with considerable familiarity through the church constable, as if accustomed to navigating in partial darkness. Tall, I should say, and wearing a dark coat, navy or black, well-tailored, suggesting someone of means rather than a casual intruder. There was something about the gait that seemed familiar, though I cannot place it precisely. They moved with considerable stealth, darting through the bell tower entrance as if they didn't wish to be seen. The Reverend interjected thoughtfully. "The churchyard is quite dark after evensong, Constable. The old oak trees cast long shadows, and the path to the bell tower is particularly obscured. One would need to know the layout well to navigate it so quickly in such dim light." Before Constable Pierce could pursue this line of inquiry further, a small commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A breathless boy from the Barchester and District Bank, his cheeks rosy with cold and the importance of his mission, approached with obvious urgency. "Constable Pierce, sir," the boy piped, clutching a folded note with official importance. "Mr. Pritchard sends word about an urgent matter concerning Major Brent's deposit box. There was an attempt to access it early this morning, just after the bank opened at 9 o'clock. Every head turned as one toward Miss Gray, whose carefully maintained composure faltered visibly. Constable Pierce accepted the note and read with growing interest. The clerk reports that a lady presented herself with a letter of authorization, insisting upon urgent retrieval of papers entrusted for safekeeping. The letter was sealed with green wax bearing holly impressions. When told that a specific key was required, the lady declined to wait and departed hastily. He looked up with official gravity. The description given was neatly dressed, dark coat, simple hat, no ornamental features, soft, cultured voice. Plain gloves, not expensive. The description seemed to hover in the warm air of the parish hall, and Miss Marple observed how it could apply to several of the assembled ladies, though it rested most uncomfortably upon Miss Grey herself. Her neat appearance, modest dress, and plain gloves matched the bank clerk's account with disturbing precision. "Miss Grey," Constable Pierce said gently, recognizing the distress in her expression, "you mentioned that Major Brent entrusted you with the key to his strong-box last evening. Might I examine it?" Miss Grey's fingers trembled as she opened her small reticule, then fumbled through its contents with increasing agitation. Her coin purse, pencil stub, and fountain pen emerged, but nothing else. The silence that followed carried the weight of unspoken accusations. "I placed it in this reticule when I left St. Mildred's last evening," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I remember the weight of it distinctly. Someone has taken it." Miss Marple, whose observational skills had been honed through decades of managing parish committees and their attendant human complications, noticed a faint smear of green on the reticule's silk lining, barely visible unless one knew precisely where to look. It was the sort of wax residue that occurred when a sealed paper was hastily opened and its contents removed. The small blister at the base of Miss Grey's finger, where sealing wax had been held too near the flame, now acquired a more troubling context. Mrs. Pottle, whose conscience had been weighing upon her as tangibly as her heavy apron, approached Constable Pierce with visible reluctance. "I fear I've been remiss, Constable. In the confusion of this morning's events, I retained one additional letter that should have been surrendered immediately. It was discovered near the grotto curtain before the tragedy occurred." Pierce received the envelope with his tweezers, noting immediately the familiar pale blue paper and green wax seal. This seal, however, had been applied more carefully than the others, without the bleeding wax that suggested haste or agitation. When he opened it, the contents proved significantly different in tone from the threatening correspondence that had preceded them. "My dearest S," he read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of official documentation, "I cannot continue with this deception any longer. The photographs must be returned to their rightful owner, and the truth must be acknowledged regardless of personal cost. Meet me after morning service, and we shall resolve this matter with the dignity it deserves. With sincere regret for the pain I've caused, H." Mrs. Carmichael's face grew pale with recognition rather than mere surprise. "That correspondence was never intended to reach Major Brent," she admitted quietly. "I placed it in the Father Christmas post by mistake when making my donation this morning, intending to retrieve it before the letters were distributed. The similarity of the envelopes caused considerable confusion in my distressed state." Dr. Hartwell, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of the evidence, straightened with the measured movements of someone who has discovered something requiring immediate attention. "Constable, I should mention that the silver box contains traces of pharmaceutical-grade potassium cyanide, not the crude variety one might obtain through industrial means. This suggests access to medical or scientific supplies, which considerably narrows the field of potential suspects." Miss Grey, whose loyalty to her employer was clearly being tested by the mounting evidence, spoke with newfound resolve that seemed to cost her considerable effort. "I should clarify my previous employment, Constable. Before accepting the position with Mrs. Carmichael, I worked for Hartwell and Associates, a pharmaceutical supply firm in London. My duties included inventory management and quality control testing, which required familiarity with various chemical compounds, including those used in medical applications. The admission created another layer of complexity to the morning's mysteries, connecting Miss Gray to both the necessary expertise and potential means for obtaining the poison that had killed Major Brent. Miss Marple reflected that such convenient revelations often served to deflect suspicion from other parties with equally relevant backgrounds. Lionel Vane, who had been maintaining an uncharacteristic silence throughout the recent revelations, seemed to be listening with more personal interest than his role as casual observer would suggest. Miss Marple detected a flicker of unease in his usually self-assured demeanor, and his gaze darted between Miss Gray and Mrs. Carmichael with what appeared to be anxious calculation. "The progression of these letters," Miss Marple observed mildly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who has spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity, "suggests that someone's campaign of intimidation was intended to conclude through direct negotiation rather than continued threats. One wonders whether the conciliatory tone indicates success in obtaining what was desired, or perhaps that events had developed beyond the writer's ability to control through mere correspondence." Her pale blue eyes rested thoughtfully on the assembled faces, noting how the morning's revelations had transformed their peaceful Christmas fare into something far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. The investigation was approaching a crucial point where carefully hidden truths would be forced into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny, and she suspected that the obvious explanations being offered might prove to be elaborate disguises for more subtle and carefully planned deceptions. "How very interesting," she murmured softly, her voice carrying the particular quality that had made her observations invaluable to 3 generations of villagers facing difficult situations. One does find that the most carefully constructed deceptions often reveal themselves through the smallest inconsistencies. A missing key that leaves traces of its removal, a letter posted in the wrong collection, pharmaceutical expertise that emerges at precisely the right moment, and always the human tendency to provide just slightly too much explanation for perfectly innocent actions. The investigation, she realized, was building toward its inevitable climax, though she suspected that the true pattern of events would prove more complex than the obvious connections being drawn between wartime secrets, missing documents, and the convenient availability of deadly expertise among the assembled suspects. Constable Pierce arranged his collection of evidence with methodical precision, the threatening letters spread across the brown paper like pieces of an elaborate puzzle demanding solution. Miss Marple, who possessed the particular gift of noticing details that others dismissed as insignificant, approached the display with the careful attention of someone examining a complex piece of needlework for dropped stitches. "Constable," she said gently, her voice carrying the deceptive mildness that had made her observations invaluable to 3 generations of villagers, "might I suggest we examine the handwriting more closely? In my experience, people's true nature often reveals itself through the smallest inconsistencies in their correspondence." She indicated the pale blue letters with a slight gesture. "The earlier threats, for S as before, and no more blunders S, show a tighter hand, the downstrokes rather pinched, the capital H with its crossbar positioned high and drawn inward. But the conciliatory letter, my dearest S, displays the same general elegance, yet with a curious hesitancy in the final loops, as if written by someone who had practiced an unfamiliar hand and, under strain, reverted to their own natural habits." Mrs. Carmichael's face grew pale with recognition rather than mere surprise, while Miss Gray's carefully maintained composure seemed to require increasing effort. Dr. Hartwell observed this exchange with professional interest, noting how stress affected each individual's physical responses differently. "Perhaps," Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, "we might reconstruct the precise sequence of events around the tea service. Mabel, my dear, would you show us exactly how Major Brent's cup was prepared?" Mabel Finch rose with visible reluctance, grateful for a task that provided distraction from the morning's increasingly complex revelations. I was maintaining the gift ledger beside Father Christmas when he requested tea. I went to the urn behind the curtain, positioned just there beside the small table. She demonstrated the movement, her hands trembling slightly. The tap has always been troublesome. One must give it a sharp tap with the knuckle to prevent dripping. The action produced the same petal-shaped splash upon the cloth that Miss Marple had noted beside the deceased's cup, confirming the accuracy of Mabel's account on this particular detail. "And the preparation?" Constable Pierce prompted, his pencil poised with official readiness. "Someone suggested milk and 2 sugars," Mabel said slowly, her brow furrowing with concentration. "But now that Dr. Hartwell mentions the Major's preferences, I realize the voice came from behind me, quite smooth and pleasant, suggesting that Father Christmas would prefer lemon for his constitution. A gloved hand reached past me with a small silver box, and there was a soft click as the lid opened. I assumed it contained lemon slices, though I never actually saw them. Dr. Hartwell, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of the tea service, straightened with the measured movements of someone who has discovered something requiring immediate documentation. "Constable, I should mention that the lipstick traces on the cup's rim appear to have been applied after the poison was administered, not before. The chemical residue shows clear stratification. The cyanide was introduced first. Then the cosmetic was carefully dabbed around the rim to create the impression that a lady had drunk from the cup." This revelation cast an entirely new light on the evidence, suggesting deliberate misdirection rather than accidental contamination. Mrs. Carmichael's relief was visible, though Miss Grey's anxiety seemed to deepen considerably. Lionel Vane, who had been maintaining an uncharacteristic silence, finally spoke with what appeared to be reluctant honesty. "I should clarify my presence here this morning, Constable. My interest in village traditions extends beyond literary research. I've been investigating certain wartime intelligence operations that involved several local residents, including Major Brent and Mrs. Carmichael. The photographs in question document activities that some parties would prefer to remain private." Mrs. Carmichael, whose resistance to questioning had been steadily eroding, spoke with careful precision. "The photographs show me in circumstances that would compromise my current social position. My work with intelligence services during the war involved activities that decent society would find difficult to understand. Major Brent possessed this documentation and was demanding considerable compensation for discretion." "The letters signed H," Miss Marple observed mildly, "suggest someone familiar with Mrs. Carmichael's wartime identity as Helena Hartwell. Yet the handwriting variations indicate that not all correspondence came from the same source. One wonders whether someone borrowed that initial to deflect suspicion while conducting their own campaign." Miss Grey, whose loyalty to her employer had been visibly tested throughout the morning's revelations, finally spoke with newfound resolve. "I must clarify certain matters, Constable. I did write some of the correspondence using Mrs. Carmichael's wartime initial to protect both our interests. Major Brent was threatening to expose not only her activities, but my own involvement in questionable wartime dealings. My pharmaceutical background provided access to substances that might resolve our difficulties permanently. The partial confession created a ripple of shocked murmurs, though Miss Marple observed that Miss Grey's admission contained careful limitations that suggested she was revealing truth while concealing crucial details. "The missing key from your reticule," Constable Pierce continued methodically, "and the attempt to access the bank strongbox this morning, might these be connected to your efforts to retrieve the compromising documents?" Before Miss Grey could respond, Mrs. Carmichael interjected with visible distress. "I went to the bank this morning, Constable, when I discovered that Miss Grey had already departed. I attempted to convince the clerk that I had authorization to retrieve the papers. It was a desperate and foolish action, but I was terrified of public exposure." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested thoughtfully on both women, noting how their accounts supported each other while carefully avoiding complete responsibility. "How very interesting," she murmured softly. "One does find that when people work together to construct explanations, they often provide just slightly too much detail for perfectly innocent actions. The human tendency to over-explain frequently reveals more than simple truth would accomplish." The investigation had reached a crucial juncture where carefully hidden secrets were being forced into daylight. Yet Miss Marple suspected that the complete truth remained more complex than the partial confessions being offered. The morning's tragedy had certainly revealed undercurrents beneath St. Mary Mead's tranquil surface, though she reflected that the most obvious explanations often disguised more subtle and dangerous realities. "I believe," she said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity, "that we are approaching the moment when all deceptions must be set aside in favor of complete honesty. The truth, however uncomfortable, has a way of revealing itself despite the most careful attempts at concealment." The assembled villagers seemed to hold their collective breath, sensing that the morning's revelations were building toward a climax that would transform their understanding of both the crime and the people they thought they knew. Miss Marple's gentle but penetrating gaze suggested that she had observed details others had missed, and that the final truth would prove more surprising than anyone had yet imagined. Miss Marple's gentle observation about approaching complete honesty seemed to settle over the assembled villagers like morning frost, creating a stillness that suggested everyone understood they were approaching the moment when all carefully constructed facades would crumble. She moved with her characteristic unhurried grace toward Mrs. Pottle, her pale blue eyes carrying the particular gleam that had made her observations invaluable through decades of village mysteries. "My dear Mrs. Pottle," she said, her voice carrying the deceptive mildness that had lulled countless wrongdoers into false security, "I wonder if you might help us with a small demonstration. Perhaps we could ask our friends to assist with addressing some charity labels, purely for organizational purposes, you understand. The children's gifts will still need proper delivery despite this morning's tragedy." Mrs. Pottle, recognizing the wisdom in Miss Marple's request, though not yet understanding its purpose, produced a stack of playing tags and distributed them among the assembled adults. "Just the street names and delivery day, if you please," she suggested with forced cheer. "Put Friday in the corner, though I suppose it will be Monday now, given the circumstances." Miss Marple positioned herself near the evidence table, apparently preoccupied with organizing the threatening correspondence, while maintaining an air of casual interest in the writing exercise. Her observant eyes, however, missed nothing as each person took up pen and began their innocent task. Miss Gray accepted her returned fountain pen and, pressing rather too hard in her nervous state, wrote out 2 tags with careful precision. Mrs. Carmichael produced her elegant, slanting letters with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to social correspondence. Lydia Brown's practical hand reflected her postal training, brisk, square letters with no unnecessary flourishes. Lionel Vane lingered momentarily, then accepted a tag with his customary novelist's smile, as if signing a first edition for an admirer. Curiously, however, he borrowed Miss Gray's pen rather than producing his own, an odd choice for a professional writer. His Friday displayed a distinctly H-shaped capital F, with the crossbar positioned high and drawn inward from the right, while his downstrokes appeared pinched and narrow, scarcely more than threads. Miss Marple's fingers stilled over her correspondence sorting as she observed this detail with the satisfaction of someone whose theory has just received confirmation. "Most helpful," Mrs. Pottle said, gathering the tags before anyone thought to examine them closely. Miss Marple, however, had already seen what she needed to see. "Mr. Vane," she said gently, her voice carrying the particular quality that had made 3 generations of villagers confess their secrets, "I've been puzzling over something rather curious about our correspondence this morning. The threatening letters, for S, as before, and no more blunders. S, display a very distinctive hand. That high crossbar on the capital H, the pinched down strokes, the particular way the writer forms their letters under stress. She indicated the pale blue papers with a slight gesture. Your handwriting sample just now shows those exact characteristics. Rather remarkable, considering you claimed no knowledge of these letters when they were first discovered. Vane's polished composure flickered momentarily, though he maintained his easy smile. Handwriting can be deceiving, Miss Marple. Many people share similar letter formations. Indeed, she agreed pleasantly. Though combined with other evidence, patterns become rather more significant. Her gaze drifted to his overcoat hanging nearby. Constable Pierce, might you examine Mr. Vane's coat cuff? I believe you'll find traces of green sealing wax, the sort that leaves faint residue when handled before it has properly cooled. Dr. Hartwell, following Miss Marple's subtle direction, noticed additional details that had previously escaped attention. Mr. Vane, that mark on your index finger, it's consistent with handling a small metal container under pressure, rather like keeping a silver box firmly closed while measuring precise quantities. The novelist's carefully maintained facade began to show strain as the evidence accumulated with inexorable logic. Miss Marple continued her gentle but relentless exposition, noting how his research into wartime intelligence operations had revealed Major Brent's possession of documents that could expose Vane's own less than honorable activities during the conflict. The beauty of being a novelist, she observed with genuine admiration, is that one understands narrative structure so well. You created a perfect mystery with multiple suspects, false clues, and misdirection. The lipstick traces applied after the poison, the blood-stained scarf from an unrelated injury, even the convenient pharmaceutical expertise that pointed toward Miss Gray. Quite masterfully constructed. Vane's hands trembled slightly as the weight of exposure settled upon him, his polished confidence cracking like ice in spring sunshine. The morning's investigation had reached its inevitable conclusion, though Miss Marple reflected that the complete confession would require more privacy than the parish hall could provide. "Shall we continue this conversation elsewhere, Mr. Vane?" Constable Pierce suggested with official gravity. "I believe we have considerable ground to cover regarding your activities both this morning and on Friday evening." The peaceful Christmas fair had finally yielded its deadly secret, though Miss Marple suspected that the full complexity of Lionel Vane's carefully orchestrated deception would take considerable time to unravel completely. The parish hall had grown quiet with the particular stillness that follows the revelation of long-hidden truths. Lionel Vane sat in the chair that Constable Pierce had provided, his novelist's composure finally abandoned in favor of the weary resignation of someone whose carefully constructed narrative has collapsed under the weight of evidence. Miss Marple positioned herself nearby, her gentle presence somehow making confession seem less like defeat and more like the natural conclusion to an overlong deception. "You see, Constable," Vane began, his voice carrying none of its earlier polished confidence. "I came to St. Mary Mead specifically because of Major Brent. My research into wartime intelligence operations wasn't entirely academic. During the war, I served in a capacity that involved questionable transactions with enemy agents. Information was currency, and I wasn't always particular about which side provided the better exchange rate. Major Brent possessed photographs that documented these activities, evidence that would destroy not just my literary career, but my entire reputation." Miss Marple nodded with the understanding of someone who has observed human nature in all its complexity. The letters threatening Mrs. Carmichael were intended to establish her as the obvious suspect, weren't they? Her genuine wartime identity as Helena Hartwell provided perfect cover for your correspondence, while her visible distress this morning reinforced the impression that she was being blackmailed. "Precisely," Vane admitted with something approaching professional appreciation for her deduction. "I borrowed her initial H, and created a campaign of intimidation that would point directly toward her if anything happened to Brent. I had observed her handwriting during social calls, practiced imitating the general style. The pharmaceutical angle pointing toward Miss Gray was equally convenient. Her background provided another layer of misdirection. He explained how he had followed Major Brent and Mrs. Carmichael to the church that Friday evening, concealing himself in the shadows near the bell tower. Their conversation was heated, but brief. When Mrs. Carmichael departed, I approached Brent myself. He was surprisingly forthcoming about the bank strongbox and Miss Gray's possession of the key. He assumed I was another victim seeking to negotiate for discretion, you see. When he showed me the photographs, actually gloating about his leverage, I realized negotiation was impossible. We struggled near the holly arrangement. He fell, cutting his hand on the thorns. I used his own scarf to stanch the bleeding, but it gave me an idea for further misdirection. Dr. Hartwell, who had been examining the evidence with renewed attention, straightened with professional certainty. The cyanide was introduced using that silver box during the tea preparation this morning. You positioned yourself behind Mabel Finch and offered what she assumed were lemon slices, knowing that Major Brent's dietary preferences would make the suggestion seem helpful rather than suspicious. I'd acquired the substance for research purposes, a novel I was writing about wartime espionage. Vane continued, his confession flowing with the relief of someone finally abandoning a burden too heavy to carry. The silver box belonged to my late mother. I'd been carrying throat lozenges in it. This morning, I emptied it, filled it with the crystalline powder, and waited for the right moment. When Mabel went to prepare his tea, I simply reached past her, suggesting Father Christmas might prefer lemon for his constitution. She never saw the contents, assumed I was offering actual lemon slices. The lipstick traces were applied afterward, he admitted with bitter precision. I borrowed Mrs. Carmichael's tube from her handbag while she was distracted by the children's activities. The blood-stained scarf was genuine. Her injury at the holly arrangement provided perfect evidence of guilt, though it was entirely unrelated to the murder itself. Even Miss Gray's broken locket played into my hands. It must have caught on something when she was arranging gifts near the grotto. Everything seemed to point away from me. Constable Pierce, methodically recording every detail, looked up from his notebook with official gravity. And the conciliatory letter, "My dearest S, that was your critical mistake." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested on him with something approaching sympathy. "Written in haste and posted by accident when you intended to retrieve it before the children's letters were distributed. Your natural handwriting emerged under stress, revealing the deception you had maintained so carefully in the threatening correspondence. The high crossbar on your capital letters, the pinched-down strokes, quite distinctive once one knows what to observe." I realized my error when Mrs. Pottle began reading the letters aloud. Vane admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The panic of that moment, knowing that my carefully constructed mystery was unraveling through such a simple mistake, nearly undid me entirely. The Reverend, who had been struggling to reconcile the morning's revelations with his understanding of human nature, finally spoke with gentle authority. "The true tragedy, Mr. Vane, is that Major Brent had actually decided to destroy those photographs after Christmas. He confided in me last week that he was weary of carrying wartime secrets and wished to begin the new year with a clear conscience. Your crime was entirely unnecessary." The words seemed to strike Vane with more force than any official accusation could have managed. His carefully maintained facade crumbled completely, revealing the frightened man beneath the polished novelist's exterior. As Constable Pierce completed the formal procedures and arrangements were made for Vane's removal to more official surroundings, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the morning's events with the mixture of satisfaction and sadness that always accompanied the resolution of human mysteries. Mrs. Pottle, demonstrating the practical wisdom that had made her invaluable through decades of parish crises, began organizing the children's activities at the far end of the hall, ensuring that young minds remained occupied while adult matters reached their inevitable conclusion. Mrs. Carmichael and Miss Grey, their own secrets now safely contained within the bounds of wartime service rather than criminal activity, began the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of complete honesty. The photographs that had caused such fear would indeed be destroyed, as Major Brent had intended, allowing both women to face their futures without the shadow of past compromises. The village gradually returned to its intended celebration, though with the subdued air that marked communities which have witnessed the revelation of carefully hidden truths. The brass players resumed their determined assault on "God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen." The raffle proceeded with Methodist efficiency, and Father Christmas's throne stood empty but somehow dignified, as if Major Brent's generous spirit lingered to bless the children's innocent hopes. Miss Marple, accepting a fresh cup of tea from Mrs. Pottle's grateful hands, settled near the window where the first snow continued to dust the churchyard with gentle persistence. The morning's mystery had been solved through careful observation of human nature rather than dramatic confrontations, confirming her long-held belief that people's true characters inevitably revealed themselves through the smallest actions and most casual words. "How very instructive," she murmured to herself, watching as Constable Pierce's bicycle disappeared down the lane with its unexpected passenger. One does find that the most elaborate deceptions often spring from the simplest fears, the terror of exposure, the desperate desire to maintain appearances, and always the human tendency to believe that complex problems require complex solutions when honesty would have served so much better. She reflected on the letter to Santa that wasn't meant for him, and how a simple misplacement had unraveled a web of deception and murder. "It always comes down to human nature, doesn't it?" she observed to Mrs. Pottle, who was now directing the careful removal of the grotto's crimson chair. "Fear, pride, the weight of old secrets. They hide beneath the most respectable exteriors, like weeds in a carefully tended garden. And sometimes it takes an unexpected frost to reveal their true roots." The Christmas fair continued around her, gradually reclaiming its intended atmosphere of community celebration and innocent hope. The tragedy would be remembered, certainly, but St. Mary Mead possessed the resilient wisdom of communities that have weathered many storms and learned to find comfort in the enduring rhythms of daily kindness and mutual support. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the parish hall, Miss Marple reflected that even the darkest secrets could not entirely overshadow the simple, human decency that made village life possible. The morning had revealed the capacity for deception and violence that existed within ordinary people, but it had also demonstrated the power of truth to restore balance and the importance of community in healing the wounds that individual failings inevitably created. "Dear Major Brent," she whispered softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who understands that the dead deserve both justice and peace. "I do hope you would approve of how your mystery was solved, not through violence or dramatic gestures, but through the patient observation of human nature and the quiet insistence that truth, however uncomfortable, must ultimately prevail over even the most carefully constructed deceptions." The snow continued to fall beyond the windows, blessing St. Mary Mead with the peaceful silence that follows the resolution of long-hidden secrets and the restoration of community trust. Christmas would come as intended, carrying with it the promise of renewal and the enduring hope that human nature, for all its capacity for darkness, retained an even greater capacity for redemption through honesty, forgiveness, and the simple grace of new beginnings.